The silver fork trembled in my hand as I set it down beside the untouched salmon on my plate. The dining room fell silent except for the grandfather clock ticking in the corner. A clock that had belonged to my late husband, one of the few things I'd managed to keep after the lawyers finished dividing our life into neat legal packages. My mother-in-law has a house by the lake, one at the beach, and another in the mountains. What about you, Mom? Still living in that cramped studio apartment? My son Nathan's words hung in the air like smoke, acid, and choking across the mahogany table. His wife Kennedy's lips curved into what she probably thought was a sympathetic smile. But I caught the glint of satisfaction in her eyes. Their children, my grandchildren, sat frozen, sensing the shift in atmosphere, even if they couldn't name it. I looked at Nathan, really looked at him. At 62, he'd inherited his father's broad shoulders, but none of his kindness. His face had grown soft with prosperity, the kind that comes from never having to choose between groceries and medication, never having to count coins at the checkout line. He wore a navy blazer that probably cost more than I'd spent on clothes in the past 2 years. Actually, I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my chest. I moved a long time ago. I traded it for a big house with an ocean view. The lie came so easily, so naturally, that for a moment I almost believed it myself. The forkful stopped. Nathan's confident smirk faltered, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. Kennedy's manicured fingers tightened around her wine glass. But only the people who care about me knew, I continued, meeting each of their eyes in turn. The silence stretched like a taut wire. My granddaughter Alice, 16 and still innocent enough to believe in fairy tales, looked confused. Grandma, you have a house by the ocean. I stood slowly, feeling every one of my 68 years in the protest of my joints. The chair legs scraped against the hardwood floor, a sound that seemed to echo in the sudden quiet. I should go, I said, reaching for my purse. Thank you for dinner. Mom, wait. Nathan's voice cracked slightly. What house? What are you talking about? I paused at the threshold of the dining room, one hand on the door frame. The family portrait hung there. Nathan's family. All smiles and coordinated outfits taken last Christmas. The Christmas I'd spent alone in my studio apartment, eating a frozen dinner and watching old movies because no one had thought to invite me. The house where I belong, I said simply. The one where the people who love me come to visit. I walked out before anyone could respond, my heels clicking against the marble foyer. Behind me, I heard the scrape of chairs, urgent whispers, Kennedy's voice sharp with something that might have been panic. The November air bit at my face as I stepped outside. Nathan's neighborhood, all manicured lawns and 3-car garages, felt foreign and cold. I'd helped him buy this house, had co-signed the mortgage when his credit wasn't quite good enough on its own. That was before Kennedy, before the gradual erosion of phone calls and visits, before I became an inconvenience rather than a mother. My hands shook as I fumbled for my car keys. The little Honda Civic looked shabby next to the BMWs and Audis in the driveway. I'd bought it used 3 years ago after selling my wedding ring, the one bit of jewelry I'd thought I'd never part with. The engine turned over with a familiar rattle, and I pulled away from the curb, leaving behind the warm light spilling from Nathan's windows. The drive back to my apartment took 23 minutes. I'd timed it many times, measuring the distance between my son's life and my own. 23 minutes through residential streets lined with houses where families gathered for Sunday dinners, where grandparents were welcomed rather than tolerated. The Sunset Manor apartment sat on the edge of downtown, a complex of beige buildings that had seen better decades. My studio was on the 3rd floor, Unit 3B. The elevator wheezed and groaned, carrying me up to a hallway that smelled of disinfectant and other people's cooking. I unlocked my door and stepped into the space that had been my entire world for the past 5 years, 400 square feet. A Murphy bed that I folded down each night and up each morning. A kitchenette with a refrigerator that hummed too loudly and a stove with only 2 working burners. A single window that looked out onto the parking lot where teenagers sometimes gathered to smoke cigarettes and laugh at things I couldn't hear. But it was mine. Every stick of furniture, every book on the crowded shelves, every photograph on the walls, all mine. No one could take it from me. No one could make me feel unwelcome in my own space. I made tea in my chipped ceramic mug, the one with the faded roses that had been my mother's. The ritual soothed me, filling the kettle, waiting for the whistle, steeping the Earl Grey until it was the perfect amber color. I settled into my reading chair, a threadbare recliner I'd rescued from a thrift store, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. The lie had surprised me. I wasn't typically a liar. My late husband, Robert, used to say I was too honest for my own good. But something about Nathan's casual cruelty, the way he dismissed my circumstances as if they were a personal failing, had unlocked something fierce and protective in my chest. My phone buzzed, a text from Nathan. "Mom, I'm sorry if that came out wrong. What did you mean about the house?" I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Let him wonder. Let him try to solve the puzzle of his mother's sudden mystery. For once, I would be the one with secrets. Another text came through. "We need to talk. This isn't like you. Wasn't like me." I almost laughed. How would he know what was like me? When was the last time he'd asked about my life, my dreams, my fears? When was the last time he'd wanted to know anything about me beyond whether I was managing okay in my little apartment? The truth was, I'd been managing more than okay. I'd been surviving day by day on a fixed income that stretched thinner each month. I'd been learning to cook for one, to celebrate holidays alone, to find joy in small things. A good book, a perfect cup of tea, the way the light slanted through my window at sunset. But survival wasn't living. And something about tonight had awakened a hunger I'd thought I'd successfully buried. I pulled out my laptop, a refurbished model I'd bought 2 years ago, and opened a browser window. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before I typed, "Ocean view houses for sale." The search results filled the screen. Pages of listings, photographs of homes perched on bluffs and nestled in coastal towns, prices that made my heart race with their impossibility. I scrolled through them anyway, letting myself imagine what it would be like to wake up to the sound of waves, to watch the sunrise paint the water golden pink. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Kennedy. "Brooklyn, Nathan is very upset. Please call, so we can work this out." Brooklyn. Not mom. Not even mother. Just my name. Formal and distant. I'd never asked them to call me anything specific. I had never demanded the intimacy of family titles, but their casual use of my first name had always stung. A small reminder that I was peripheral to their lives. I turned off my phone and closed the laptop. Tomorrow, I would have to face the consequences of my impulsive lie. Tomorrow, I would have to explain or deflect or somehow maintain the fiction I'd created. But tonight, I allowed myself the luxury of possibility. I pulled the Murphy bed down from the wall and changed into my nightgown, a soft cotton one I'd bought for myself last birthday since no one else had remembered. The fabric smelled like the lavender sachets I kept in my dresser drawer, a small indulgence that made my cramped space feel more like home. As I settled under the covers, I thought about the ocean. I'd grown up in coastal Maine and had spent my childhood summers running barefoot on rocky beaches, collecting shells and sea glass. Robert and I had honeymooned in a little cottage overlooking the Atlantic. We had talked about retiring somewhere where we could hear the waves each morning. But Robert had died at 54, a heart attack that stole him away on a Tuesday morning in March. I had been left to navigate the aftermath, the bills, the lawyers, the slow dissolution of the life we'd built together. Nathan had been in his early 30s then, wrapped up in his own young family, offering sympathy but little practical help. Now, lying in the dark, I wondered what Robert would think of the woman I'd become. Would he recognize the person who'd told such a bold, beautiful lie? Would he understand why I'd chosen mystery over explanations, dignity over groveling for scraps of affection? The sound of sirens wailed in the distance, carrying someone else's emergency into the night. I closed my eyes and imagined instead the sound of waves, the cry of seagulls, the whisper of wind through beach grass. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But tonight, I was a woman with secrets, a woman with possibilities, a woman who owned a house by the ocean that existed only in the space between truth and dream. And for the first time in years, that felt like enough. The next morning brought a clarity I hadn't expected. I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand. 17 missed calls from Nathan, 12 from Kennedy, and a string of text messages that grew increasingly desperate with each passing hour. "Mom, please call me back. We're worried about you. This isn't funny anymore. Kennedy thinks you might be having some kind of episode." An episode. I almost laughed as I deleted the messages without reading them all. The only episode one was having was one of long, overdue self-respect. I made my morning tea and sat by the window, watching the parking lot come alive with people heading to work. Mrs. Chen from 2A walked her ancient Pomeranian. Mr. Rodriguez loaded his truck with landscaping equipment, and the college students from the building next door stumbled out, looking like they'd made poor choices the night before. These were my neighbors, my community. Not the manicured perfection of Nathan's subdivision, but real people living real lives. When Mrs. Chen had fallen and broken her hip last winter, I'd driven her to doctor's appointments. When Mr. Rodriguez's wife had died, I'd brought him casseroles and sat with him while he cried. When the college students had locked themselves out at 2 a.m., I'd let them use my phone to call a locksmith. This was belonging. This was being needed. My phone rang. Nathan again. I stared at his name on the screen, remembering the little boy who used to crawl into my lap when he had nightmares, who'd made me Mother's Day cards with construction paper and glitter. When had we lost each other? When had I become a burden instead of a blessing? I answered on the 6th ring. "Mom, thank God. We've been trying to reach you all night." "I was sleeping," I said mildly. "People my age need their rest." "About last night. I'm sorry if I upset you, but you have to understand how crazy this sounds. A house by the ocean. Mom, your last bank statement. You've been looking at my bank statements." The words came out sharper than I intended. A pause. Kennedy was worried. "She asked me to check on your finances. Make sure you weren't being scammed or what, Nathan? Or losing my mind." "That's not what I meant." But his voice carried the weight of exactly what he meant. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar tug of wanting to smooth things over, to make myself smaller so everyone else could be comfortable. The old Brooklyn would have apologized, would have explained away the confusion, would have made herself the problem to solve rather than the person to respect. "I need to go," I said instead.
"Mom, wait.
"Let's meet for coffee. Let's talk about this." "There's nothing to talk about." I said what I said, but it doesn't make sense. "Where would you get the money for?" I hung up. The silence that followed felt like freedom and terror in equal measure. I'd never hung up on Nathan before. I'd never refused to explain myself. Never left him to wonder about my life or my choices. The power of it was intoxicating. But the fear was real, too. What if he drove over here? What if he demanded to see this fictional house? What if my moment of defiance collapsed under the weight of practical questions? I needed air. I needed to think. I dressed carefully in my best navy slacks and the cashmere sweater I'd bought myself for Christmas. A small indulgence that had felt scandalous at the time. I drove to the harbor 20 minutes away, where the fishing boats bobbed in the early morning mist. The ocean stretched endlessly before me, gray, green, and powerful. I'd forgotten how it felt to stand at the edge of something vast, something that made human problems seem small and temporary. The salt air filled my lungs, sharp and clean. Beautiful morning for it. I turned to find a woman about my age approaching. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore paint-stained jeans and a fisherman's sweater that looked like it had seen decades of use. "Yes," I agreed.
It is.
"I'm Florence Finney," she said, extending a hand. "I have a studio in the old warehouse district. I come down here when I need to remember why I paint seascapes." "Brooklyn Hillis." I shook her hand, surprised by the strength of her grip. "You look like you're working through something," Florence said, settling onto a nearby bench. "The ocean's good for that." I found myself sitting beside her, though I couldn't say why. Strangers made me nervous usually. But there was something steady about Florence, something that invited honesty. "I told a lie yesterday," I said, surprising myself. "A big one." "Good for you," Florence's response was immediate and fierce. About time you had some secrets. I stared at her. You don't even know what I lied about. Doesn't matter. The way you said it tells me everything I need to know. Someone's been making you feel small, and you decided to take up some space. She smiled, and I noticed paint under her fingernails, blue and white ocean colors. What was the lie? I told my son I own a house by the ocean. And do you? Of course not. I live in a studio apartment downtown. I can barely afford groceries some months. Florence was quiet for a moment, watching the waves. You know, I've been living in the same house for 30 years. Bought it when my husband died, and I needed a fresh start. It's nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms, needs work, but every morning I wake up to this view. She gestured toward the water. Been thinking about getting a roommate, someone to help with expenses, and maybe provide some company. My heart started beating faster. A roommate? The right roommate? Someone who understands that silence is golden but conversation is silver. Someone who won't judge me for painting at 3 o'clock in the morning or making coffee at 5. She looked at me sideways. Someone who might appreciate waking up to the sound of waves. I felt something shift inside my chest, like a door opening that had been locked for years. I don't know if I could afford utilities split 2 ways, maybe $400 a month. I'm not looking to make money, just to share the space and the bills. It was more than I was paying for the studio, but not impossibly more. And to wake up to the ocean every morning, to have the lie become truth.
Why?
I asked. Why would you offer this to a stranger? Florence stood and brushed sand from her jeans. Because 30 years ago, I was a stranger in this town with a broken heart and no idea how to rebuild my life. Someone helped me then. Maybe it's time to pass that forward. She pulled a business card from her pocket, a simple white cardstock with her name and phone number. Think about it. If you're interested, call me. I'll show you the place. After she left, I sat on the bench for another hour, turning the card over and over in my hands. The morning sun burned off the mist, revealing the water in all its glory, silver and blue and endless. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries mixing with the sound of waves against the rocks. My phone buzzed. Another text from Nathan. Mom, Kennedy and I are coming over tonight. We need to talk about getting you some help. Help? As if I were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. As if my moment of mystery was evidence of decline rather than growth. I looked at Florence's card again, then at the ocean stretching toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, possibilities waited. Somewhere out there, a woman named Brooklyn Hillis could wake up to the sound of waves, paint seascapes, and drink coffee at 5 in the morning without explaining herself to anyone. I stood and walked to the edge of the pier, letting the wind whip my hair around my face. The old Brooklyn would have gone home and waited for Nathan and Kennedy to arrive. She would have apologized for the confusion and let them rearrange her life to ease their consciences. But the new Brooklyn, the one who owned a house by the ocean, the one who had secrets and possibilities, she had other plans. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number on the card. Florence, it's Brooklyn. About that room. The waves crashed against the rocks below, applauding my decision, welcoming me home to a life I'd almost forgotten I wanted. Nathan and Kennedy could come looking for me tonight. They could worry and wonder and try to solve the puzzle of my disappearance. But they would find only an empty studio apartment and a note that read, "Gone to the ocean. The people who care about me know where to find me." The truth at last, and the most beautiful lie I'd ever told. About to become real. Avaf. Florence's house perched on a bluff overlooking the harbor like a weathered lighthouse keeper's cottage. The cedar shingles had turned silver with age, and the wraparound porch sagged slightly under the weight of decades of storms, but the windows faced east toward the ocean. And when she opened the front door, the sound of waves filled the air like a constant lullaby. "It's not much," she said, leading me through rooms painted in soft blues and grays. "But it's home. Not much." The woman was insane. The living room had built-in bookshelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with art books and poetry collections. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel decorated with pieces of sea glass and smooth stones. And everywhere, there were paintings, seascapes that captured the ocean in all its moods, from storm-tossed fury to mirror-calm serenity. You painted all these? I asked, stopping before a canvas that showed the harbor at sunset. The water was painted in shades of gold and pink that made my chest ache with longing. 30 years' worth, Florence said. The ocean changes every day. I try to keep up. The bedroom she showed me was small but perfect. A dormer window looked out over the water, and I could imagine waking each morning to that view. A writing desk sat beneath the window as if waiting for someone to sit and compose letters to the horizon. The previous tenant was a writer, Florence explained. She lived here for 3 years working on a novel about fishing families. Sweet girl, but she got married and moved to Portland. A writer. I'd always wanted to write. I had filled journals with observations and stories back when I thought I had time for dreams. Maybe here, with the ocean as my muse, I could find those words again. I'll take it, I said, surprising myself with a certainty in my voice. Florence smiled. Don't you want to think about it? Talk it over with your family? My family thinks I'm losing my mind. They're probably at my apartment right now, planning an intervention. I turned back to the window, watching fishing boats navigate the harbor. For the first time in years, I know exactly what I want. Good. When can you move in? Is tomorrow too soon? That evening, I sat in my studio apartment for the last time, surrounded by boxes I'd packed with methodical precision. Everything I owned fit into 12 cardboard containers, a lifetime reduced to manageable portions. The efficiency of it was both liberating and heartbreaking. I'd left Nathan's frantic voicemails unanswered. I had ignored Kennedy's texts asking if I was having an episode. Let them wonder. Let them drive over here and find me gone. The note I'd written sat on the kitchen counter, propped against the coffee maker that had been my constant companion for 5 years. At 8 o'clock, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Then Nathan's voice raised an argument with Mr. Rodriguez. I'm her son. I need to check on her. She's not answering her phone. She don't want to talk to you. I think Mr. Rodriguez replied in his careful English. She's a very smart lady. She knows what she's doing. Sir, I appreciate your concern, but my mother is elderly and confused. She's been saying things that don't make sense. Elderly and confused. The words hit me like physical blows. I pressed my ear to the door, listening to my son reduce me to a diagnosis, a problem to be managed. She helped me when my Maria died, Mr. Rodriguez said firmly. She brought food. Sat with me when I cried. She's a good woman. You know, worry about her. But she's talking about owning a house by the ocean. That's impossible. She can barely afford this place. Maybe she has more than you think. Maybe she has things you don't understand. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Then came the knock on my door. Firm, demanding. Mom, I know you're in there. Open up. I stood frozen, my hand on the deadbolt. The old Brooklyn would have opened the door, would have apologized and explained and made everything comfortable for everyone else, but she was gone, packed away with my old life. Brooklyn. Kennedy's voice now, saccharine with false concern. We just want to make sure you're okay. Dr. Patterson said confusion can be a sign of. I'm fine, I called through the door. And I'm moving out tomorrow. A pause. Then Nathan's voice, sharp with panic. Moving where? Mom, you can't just disappear. I'm not disappearing. I'm going home. This is your home. I looked around the cramped studio at the Murphy bed folded against the wall, at the window that looked out on asphalt and streetlights. No, I said quietly. This was just where I was staying. Mom, please let us help you. We can find you a nice assisted living facility somewhere with activities and other elderly confused people, I finished. Thank you, but I have other plans. I heard them whispering on the other side of the door, urgent and frustrated. Then Kennedy's voice louder. Brooklyn, we're not leaving until you open this door. So, I didn't open it. I made tea and sat in my reading chair, listening to them argue in the hallway. Eventually, Mrs. Chin came out and scolded them in rapid Mandarin. Then Mr. Rodriguez emerged again, this time with his grown son who worked construction and looked like he could bench press a small car. "Maybe you go now," he suggested mildly. "Mrs. Hillis, she's tired." They left, but not before Nathan called through the door one more time. "This isn't over, Mom. We're going to figure out what's really going on." I almost laughed. What was really going on was the most honest thing I'd done in years. The next morning, I loaded my boxes into the Honda and drove to the harbor. Florence met me at the house, wearing paint-stained overalls and a smile that made the November morning feel like spring. "Ready for your new life?" she asked, helping me carry boxes up the porch steps. "More than ready." We spent the morning unpacking, and I was amazed at how my possessions looked in the new space. My mother's china seemed to glow in the ocean light streaming through the windows. My books filled one shelf of the living room built-ins, as if they belonged there. The photograph of Robert and me on our honeymoon found a place on the mantel where the morning sun would touch it each day. "Tell me about him," Florence said, nodding toward the picture. "Robert, he died 14 years ago. Heart attack." I touched the frame gently. "We were going to retire by the ocean. He always said the sound of waves was better than any sleeping pill. What happened to that dream?" Life happened. Bills, lawyers, Nathan's disapproval. I convinced myself I was being practical, staying close to family. I shook my head. Turns out family is more about choice than proximity. That afternoon, Florence insisted on taking me to the harbor market to stock up on groceries. The woman at the fish counter knew her by name, as did the baker and the produce vendor. They welcomed me warmly when she introduced me as her new housemate. And I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: belonging. "You'll fit right in," said Janet Waters, who ran the seafood stand. "Florence has been talking about finding a roommate for months. She said she wanted someone who understood that the ocean wasn't just scenery. It was a way of life." Walking back to the house, our arms full of groceries, I felt lighter than I had in years. The afternoon sun painted the water gold, and fishing boats dotted the harbor like a living painting. This was what I dreamed of, what I'd almost forgotten I wanted. My phone buzzed. A text from Nathan. "Mom, we've been to your apartment. The landlord says you moved out. Where are you? We're worried sick." I looked at the message, then at the ocean stretching toward the horizon. For the first time in years, I was exactly where I belonged. I typed back, "I'm at my house by the ocean. The people who care about me know where to find me." Then I turned off my phone and followed Florence up the porch steps, the sound of waves welcoming me home. But as I settled into my new life, I couldn't shake the feeling that Nathan wouldn't give up so easily. He'd always been determined, stubborn to a fault. And the thought of him searching for me, trying to solve my disappearance, sent a chill through the evening air. What would he do when he couldn't find me? What lengths would he go to in order to prove I was confused, incompetent, in need of management? The questions followed me into my new bedroom, where I lay listening to the ocean and wondering if my beautiful lie had consequences I hadn't yet imagined. Outside, the waves crashed against the rocks with increasing force, as if the sea itself was preparing for a storm. The storm arrived 3 days later, and it wasn't the weather. I was sitting at the writing desk in my bedroom, working on a letter to Robert, something I'd started doing since moving to the house, as if the ocean had given me permission to speak to the dead. The morning light filtered through the salt-stained windows, painting everything in shades of pearl and silver. Florence was in her studio, working on a new painting of the harbor at dawn. The piece shattered when I heard car doors slamming in the driveway. From my window, I watched Nathan emerge from his BMW, followed by Kennedy and a woman I didn't recognize, middle-aged, carrying a briefcase, wearing the kind of sensible shoes that suggested official business. Behind them came another car, and my heart sank as I recognized Dr. Patterson, Nathan's family physician. "Florence," I called downstairs. "We have visitors." She appeared in the doorway, paintbrush still in hand, her face darkening as she looked out the window. "Looks like an ambush." Nathan's knock was sharp and demanding. When Florence opened the door, I heard his voice carry up the stairs, confident, patronizing. The tone of a man who believed he was solving a problem. "Good morning." I'm Nathan Moak, Brooklyn's son. I believe you have my mother staying here. Brooklyn Hillis lives here. Yes, she's my housemate. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. My mother is unwell. She's been having episodes of confusion, making claims that aren't based in reality. We're here to help her. I crept to the top of the stairs, listening to the conversation that would determine the course of my life. She seems perfectly lucid to me, Florence said, and I could hear the ice in her voice. Very intelligent, actually. Great conversationalist. Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but you don't understand the situation. My mother has been living in a studio apartment downtown for 5 years. She can barely afford her medications. The idea that she could pay rent on a place like this is impossible. Perhaps you don't know your mother as well as you think. The woman with the briefcase spoke up. Mr. Nathan, perhaps we should speak with Mrs. Hillis directly. I'm Linda Albright, a social worker with Adult Protective Services. We received a call expressing concern about an elderly woman who may be experiencing financial exploitation. My blood turned to ice. Nathan had called APS on me, his own mother. Brooklyn. Florence called up the stairs. Would you come down, please? There are some people here who'd like to speak with you. I descended slowly, feeling every eye on me. I dressed carefully that morning in my best slacks and a sweater Florence had complimented, but I wondered if they saw only an elderly woman playing dress-up in delusions of grandeur. Hello, Nathan.
Kennedy.
I nodded to them with cool politeness.
Dr. Patterson, Ms. Albright.
Nathan stepped forward, his face a mask of concern. Mom, we've been so worried. You left without telling anyone where you were going. We found your apartment empty, your phone going to voicemail. I told you I was moving to my house by the ocean. I wasn't lying. But Mom, this isn't your house. This is, he gestured helplessly around the room. How could you afford this? I looked at him for a long moment, seeing not my son, but a stranger who'd reduced me to a financial statement, a problem to be solved. Nathan, when was the last time you asked me about my life, my dreams, my feelings? When was the last time you wanted to know anything about me beyond whether I was managing my pills correctly? That's not fair, is it? I turned to Ms. Albright. You received a call about financial exploitation. May I ask who made that call? She consulted her notes. The caller reported that an elderly woman was claiming to own property beyond her means, possibly being taken advantage of by strangers. And the caller's name? I'm not at liberty to say. It was Nathan. I didn't make it a question. My son called you because I moved out of the hell he was comfortable with me living in. Nathan's face flushed. Mom, that's not how it happened. You were talking about a house by the ocean, making claims that didn't make sense. I was worried you were being scammed. By whom? Florence? A woman who offered me a beautiful room at below market rent because she wanted company. Dr. Patterson stepped forward. Brooklyn, I think we should sit down and talk about this. There may be some cognitive issues we need to address. My cognition is fine. Thank you. But if you'd like to test it, I'm happy to oblige. I turned to Nathan. You want to know how I can afford this? Fine. Let me tell you what I've been doing with my money instead of explaining myself to children who see me as a burden. I walked to the mantel and picked up a folder I'd been keeping there. My real financial documents, not the simplified statements I'd been showing Nathan to avoid his lectures about spending. I've been investing, Nathan, for 14 years since your father died. Small amounts, careful choices, companies I believed in, index funds, dividend stocks. While you were assuming I was incompetent, I was building a portfolio. I opened the folder and handed him the most recent statement. His face went white. This can't be right. $73,000, I said calmly. Not wealthy, but enough to pay rent on a room with an ocean view. Enough to live with dignity instead of just surviving. Kennedy grabbed the paper from Nathan's hands, her eyes widening. But you said you couldn't afford. I said I could barely afford groceries some months. That was true, because I was investing every spare penny instead of spending it on things that didn't matter. I was building a future for myself, since my family seemed to have written me off. Miss Albright looked confused. So there's no financial exploitation? None at all. I'm renting a room from a friend. I pay my bills on time. I'm mentally competent and financially stable. I fix Nathan with a steady gaze. The only exploitation here is emotional. My son's inability to see me as anything other than a problem to be managed. The room fell silent except for the sound of waves against the rocks. Dr. Patterson cleared his throat. Brooklyn, I think there may have been some miscommunication. There was no miscommunication. Nathan called you because he couldn't accept that his mother had resources he didn't know about. Friends he'd never met. A life that existed outside his narrow view of what was appropriate for someone my age. Nathan's voice cracked. Mom, I was trying to protect you from what? From happiness? From independence? From the radical idea that I might know what's best for myself? I saw something break in his face, then a recognition of what he'd done, what he'd assumed, but I felt no urge to comfort him, no maternal instinct to smooth over his embarrassment. That woman was gone, buried with my old life. I think we should go, Ms. Albright said quietly. Mrs. Hillis, I'm sorry for the intrusion. It's clear you're managing your affairs quite well. As they filed out, Nathan paused at the door.
Mom, I'm sorry.
I didn't know about the investments. I know what you thought. You thought I was a foolish old woman who couldn't take care of herself. You thought I was your responsibility instead of your mother. I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. The difference is I never thought you were anything less than capable of understanding that distinction. After they left, Florence and I sat in the living room, watching the harbor through the windows. The confrontation had left me shaking, but not with fear, with a kind of fierce satisfaction. 73,000, Florence said finally. Nicely done. I started with the life insurance money from Robert's death. 20,000, invested it carefully, added to it when I could. I smiled. Nathan thinks I'm financially incompetent because I choose to live below my means. He never asked why. And why do you? Because money isn't security. Independence is the ability to choose your own life. To move to the ocean when you want to say no to people who don't respect you. I looked around the room that had become my sanctuary. This is what I was saving for. This moment, this choice, this freedom. My phone buzzed. A text from Nathan. Mom, we need to talk. I was wrong about some things. I read the message, then deleted it without responding. Let him sit with his wrongness. Let him wonder if the bridges he'd burned could ever be rebuilt. Outside, the ocean stretched toward the horizon, constant and eternal. I'd weathered the storm, but I suspected bigger ones were coming. Nathan wouldn't give up easily, and his humiliation today would fester. But for the first time in years, I was ready for whatever came next. 6 months later, I was sitting on the porch watching the sunrise paint the harbor in shades of gold and coral when I heard the familiar sound of gravel crunching in the driveway. But this time, it wasn't Nathan's BMW. It was a small red sedan I didn't recognize. The car door opened and a young woman emerged, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing paint-splattered jeans and a nervous expression. She looked around uncertainly before walking toward the porch. Mrs. Hillis, she called out. I'm looking for Brooklyn Hillis. That's me. I set down my coffee cup and studied her. Something about her seemed familiar, though I couldn't place where I might have seen her before. I'm Alice, she said, climbing the porch steps. I'm your granddaughter, Nathan's daughter. My heart stopped. Alice, the 16-year-old who'd looked so confused at that terrible dinner, who'd asked innocently about my ocean house, but she was older now, maybe 22 or 23, with the kind of confidence that comes from surviving your own mistakes. Alice, I said her name carefully, as if it might break in my mouth. You're not 16 anymore. She laughed, a sound surprisingly warm. No, I'm 24 now. I graduated from art school last year. I've been trying to find you for months. Your father knows where I am. Dad doesn't know I'm here. She paused, looking out at the ocean. He forbade me from contacting you. Said you were going through some kind of breakdown and that it wasn't safe for the family to enable your delusions. The words hit me like a physical blow. Even after the confrontation with Adult Protective Services, even after seeing my financial statements, Nathan was still spinning narratives about my mental state, still protecting his version of events where he was the concerned son, and I was the problem. And you believed him for a while, but then I started thinking about that night at dinner, about what you said, about the house by the ocean, about how only people who cared about you would know where it was. She smiled. I realized I wanted to be one of those people. I studied her face, looking for traces of Nathan's manipulation, signs that this was another attempt to manage me. But all I saw was a young woman who looked tired and hopeful and genuinely sorry. How did you find me? I hired a private investigator. Cost me 3 months of tips from my waitressing job, but I had to know if you were really okay. She pulled out her phone and showed me a photo of the house. When I saw this place, I knew you'd been telling the truth all along. I gestured to the chair beside me.
Sit.
Tell me what's been happening. She settled into the wicker chair, accepting the coffee I offered. Dad's been difficult since that day he came here. He's convinced you're being taken advantage of, that someone is manipulating you. He's been trying to get a lawyer to declare you incompetent. On what grounds? He says, you're exhibiting signs of dementia, making irrational financial decisions, isolating yourself from family. She took a sip of coffee and grimaced. He's been building a case, collecting evidence of your erratic behavior. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Evidence like moving to a house I can afford, like having investments he didn't know about. He's been going through your old medical records looking for anything that might support his claim. He found records of you seeing a therapist after Grandpa Robert died, and he's trying to use that as evidence of mental instability. The violation of it took my breath away. Nathan had been investigating me like a criminal, building a case against my competence based on my grief over losing his father. The son I'd raised, the boy I'd loved unconditionally, had turned my sorrow into a weapon. What does your mother think about all this? Mom goes along with whatever Dad says. She's been telling people you had some kind of psychotic break, that you're living in a fantasy world. Alice's voice hardened. She's been playing the part of the concerned daughter-in-law, talking about how hard it is to watch someone you love lose touch with reality. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of their betrayal settle around me like a heavy cloak. They'd stolen my story, rewritten my independence as illness, my strength as delusion, and they'd done it with the kind of self-righteous conviction that made them believe they were the heroes of this narrative. Why are you telling me this, Alice? Because it's wrong. And because I owe you an apology. She set down her coffee cup and looked at me directly. I was there that night at dinner. I heard what Dad said about your apartment, saw how it hurt you, and I did nothing. You were 16. I was old enough to know cruelty when I saw it. Old enough to speak up. She leaned forward. I've been thinking about that night for years. About how you just disappeared. And I realized that maybe disappearing was the bravest thing you could have done. We sat in silence for a moment, listening to the waves. I felt something shift inside me, a softening I hadn't expected. This young woman had spent months and money she couldn't afford to find me. Not to drag me back into the family fold, but to apologize for her silence. Tell me about art school, I said finally. Her face lit up. I studied painting landscapes mostly. I know it's not very original, but there's something about capturing light and water that just speaks to me. Like your great-grandmother, my mother painted watercolors. Nothing fancy, just little scenes from her garden. But she saw beauty in ordinary things. Dad never told me that. There's a lot your father doesn't tell you about this family, about me. I stood up. Would you like to see something? I led her inside to my bedroom where I'd set up a small writing desk by the window. The surface was covered with notebooks, letters, and the beginnings of what might someday become a book. You're writing, she said, wonder in her voice. I always wanted to. Your grandfather and I used to talk about the stories we'd tell when we had time. I picked up one of the notebooks. Turns out you make time for the things that matter. She flipped through the pages, reading passages about life by the ocean, about finding yourself after loss, about the courage it takes to start over. This is beautiful, Grandma. You should publish this, Grandma. The word hit me like a gift I hadn't expected. When had Nathan's children stopped calling me that? When had I become just Brooklyn, a name without relationship, without love? Stay for lunch, I said impulsively. I'll call Florence down from her studio. You can see her paintings. We spent the afternoon on the porch sharing stories and looking through Florence's portfolio. Alice had inherited the family eye for art, and she and Florence fell into an easy discussion about technique and inspiration. Watching them together, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The joy of being part of a conversation where my age was irrelevant, where I was valued for my thoughts rather than tolerated for my presence. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Alice turned to me. "I want to keep coming here, if that's okay with you." "What about your father?" "What about him?" "I'm 24 years old. I make my own choices about who I love," she smiled. "And I choose you." The words were like a balm on wounds I'd thought had scarred over, but they also brought a sharp awareness of what I'd lost, what Nathan had stolen from me with his assumptions and his need for control. "Your father won't give up easily," I warned her. "He's still trying to prove I'm incompetent. Let him try." I've seen the woman who built a new life by the ocean, who had the courage to walk away from people who didn't value her. There's nothing incompetent about that. It's been almost 2 years since I walked away from Nathan's dinner table and stepped into the life I didn't know I was allowed to want. Nathan's attempt to have me declared incompetent failed spectacularly. After the visit from Adult Protective Services, word got around. Small towns have a way of chewing secrets into headlines. People whispered about how he tried to institutionalize his mother for moving into a house with a view. When the truth surfaced, that I had savings, investments, and a life of my own, he became a cautionary tale, not a concerned son. Even Dr. Patterson distanced himself, quietly noting in his records that I was of sound mind and spirit. It was humiliating for Nathan, I'm sure. But I didn't feel vindictive, just tired of explaining myself. So I stopped. I let him stew in the shame of his assumptions. Let him deal with the silence that followed. And to his credit, or maybe just his pride, he never came back. Alice did, though. She moved into the guest room at Florence's house some months after our reunion, bringing with her paintbrushes, canvas rolls, and the gentle kind of defiance that comes from choosing to love someone your parents said was broken. We turned the old shed behind the house into a studio. What started as afternoon painting sessions soon bloomed into something bolder, a storefront. Alice named it Two Tides. "Because we're different generations but pulled by the same moon," she said with a grin. We painted together side by side. She with her bold modern strokes and color bursts, and I with my slower, more contemplative seascapes. Mine were simpler, quieter, but they sold. People said they felt calm when they looked at them, peaceful, whole. One afternoon, a man in a linen blazer and tortoiseshell glasses walked into the store. He spent nearly an hour studying our work before introducing himself as Leonard Prescott, owner of a well-known gallery up the coast. He asked if we'd consider exhibiting at their upcoming show on coastal artistry. "Both of us?" Alice asked, blinking. "Especially both of you," he said, eyes crinkling at the corners. "There's something rare here. Generational resonance. You can feel the story beneath the paint." The gallery event was a whirlwind. Wine glasses, tiny hors d'oeuvres, polite applause. I wore the blue silk scarf Alice gave me for Christmas and tried not to tremble as strangers examined my brush strokes. When one of my paintings, Low Tide at Dusk, sold for $2,400, I nearly fainted. By the end of the night, we'd sold 9 pieces between us.
9.
That money, combined with the nest egg I'd been nurturing for years, was enough. Enough for a down payment on a small cottage less than 10 minutes from the gallery. Perched on a cliff with a real honest-to-God ocean view. This time it wasn't a dream or a deflection. It was mine. Alice and I moved in last spring. She occupies the attic loft where she paints with the skylight open and music playing from her speakers. I wake up early and write letters I'll never send to Robert while the kettle boils and the gulls cry overhead. We paint. We laugh. We belong. Sometimes customers ask about the story behind our shop's name. I smile and tell them it started with a lie I once told over dinner. A lie that turned out to be the truest thing I'd ever said.
Nathan.
I haven't heard from him in over a year. Last I knew, his reputation never quite recovered. People remember the headlines. They remember the woman who proved him wrong with grace instead of vengeance. And me? I live in a house by the ocean now. Not just in words, not just in dreams. I live here with the granddaughter who chose love over legacy. And with a life I built brushstroke by brushstroke, decision by decision. The waves still crash. The wind still hums through the beach grass. And each morning the tide reminds me nothing stays buried forever. Truth rises. So does peace. And I finally come home,